Welcome to the latest installment of ABL Advisors video series featuring thought leaders from the asset-based lending and commercial finance industry. I'm Mike Toglia, the publisher of ABL Advisor, and today our guest is Ken Mann, the Managing Director of SC&H Capital. Thanks for being here today, Ken.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate being here.
It's our pleasure. I'd like to start in on the topic of today's discussion, which is basically to cover your insights into what's been happening in the distressed M&A environment over the past year and where we are today, what you've seen in the marketplace. And
okay, sounds good.
And with that being the case, what I'd like to do, I'll just start in on the first question and see, we'll take it from there. And as the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the US economy in 2020, how would you describe the level of middle market M&A activity among privately held distressed companies in 2020, and how are things going so far this year?
I would say, let's put it into three time frames, Mike. Early on, Q1, early Q2 of 2020, we saw a lot of activity on the distress side. There was kind of a rush to get things done that were already in market or already in the workout department. And on the healthy side of our practice, things came to a screaming halt in March. Then looking at the second bucket, if you will, call it mid Q2 of 2020, as you see government intervention, really generous forbearance from lenders, a realization that certain things just really couldn't be sold. For example, restaurant chains, that they just might be too difficult to sell. Things really slowed on the distress side. People kind of pressed the pause button, but the healthy side took off a bit at that point. As I look March of 21 through now, healthy has continued to be on fire, and the distress side is now starting to pick up.
So there was activity in both the distressed and healthy side, but certainly things slowed down, as you just mentioned, Ken. Now, what types of businesses were experiencing some distress prior to the COVID-19 crisis, and what happened to them as a result of the pandemic over the past year?
Well, all kinds of businesses, right? Because it wasn't specific to COVID. It was just businesses that got in trouble for all the reasons businesses always get in trouble. They tapped out on their line of credit. They just didn't have liquidity. Maybe they hadn't invested in technology or machinery and equipment, and they hadn't kept up with the times. So margins were too thin, lost a big customer, whatever the case. But I believe there were a lot of businesses in 2019 that really were already facing distress. As to what happened to them, I think, I use this analogy, Mike. They were swimming naked. They were standing on the beach naked, let's say, but the tide of PPP money and other things, including lenders' forbearance, came in and hid that fact. So I think companies that were in trouble pre-COVID kind of got a free pass for a year. They just hit out. They didn't come to market. They probably didn't even really go through a workout. And so now the question is, what happens as that PPP money and other things begin to recede? Now lenders begin to see who is standing there naked, and they will have to be dealt with in the year ahead.
And there seems to be a common theme that a lot of folks had this injection of liquidity, and it impacted them very positively for that period of time. Were there any other things that impacted these companies as well? For example, was supply chain something that was a major impact for folks from what you saw out there?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we want to talk about, what were the issues that impacted what did come to market, I guess my answer would be a bit different. I think, first of all, PPP and other funds had the biggest impact on what did come to market. Let's say that. It bought them time, it fixed their balance sheet, all the things you've probably heard other people say. As to those that did get into trouble as a result of COVID, think healthcare, think retail, hospitality, their market effectively closed, right? And so they got into trouble because they didn't have a place to sell their product anymore. They were basically shut down. What they faced, I think the big problems they faced were uncertainty, a lack of visibility, right? Would there be more shutdowns? when would the economy be fully open? In some cases, the question would be, hey, have buyers' habits permanently changed? So that uncertainty made it very difficult in going to market. You mentioned supply chains. Yeah, definitely some issues there, right? You had plant closures, first in Asia, but then essentially everywhere. I think in the first half of the year, more so than later, trucking was pretty damaged. I think you could pick certain industries like, let's take lumber, for example. Lumber mills said, well, who could ever want to buy lumber in the middle of a global pandemic, right? So scaled back production, didn't buy as many logs, shut some mills. As it turns out, the answer to that question is apparently everybody wanted to buy lumber in the middle of a pandemic. Prices tripled during that time. So certain suppliers just forecast a much worse downturn than they experienced, and so as a result, that did damage the supply chains. That was definitely an issue. If I think about the actual M&A process, especially early on, it was people just wouldn't travel, right? So you need to get somebody to come and look at a manufacturing plant. They weren't doing it. We actually did site visits, management meetings, and auctions with Zoom for a period of time. And then maybe the last thing I would mention is there was probably about, I don't know, I'll say 10% spread in what the sellers and the buyers thought the COVID discount should be. And when I say sellers, I include in that the secured creditor, right? They just weren't prepared to take the hit that the buyer thought they were entitled to for the risk. So that did impede some of the M&A activity during the time.
Has that in any way shifted now? I mean, you talked a little bit about the fact that things are getting better right now in the first part of this year. So with some of the items that you just mentioned, are you seeing a turnaround in those issues?
Yeah, sir. I mean, I think the visibility issue is the big one, right? I mean, now with half of the country vaccinated and that's growing rapidly, I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's still uncertainty in many markets as to what the new normal will look like, right? Like office space. I mean, COVID might be nearing an end, but I don't know that that means office space is going to quickly turn around. But yeah, as far as the process, it's improved. People are beginning to travel again. They're less fearful. Lenders are beginning to see about at the same level that buyers are. Buyers are realizing it's a very competitive market. Multiples on the healthy side are through the roof, and they're not going to get a huge discount. They're going to have to look at what was the business doing pre-COVID. By the way, many companies are doing much better as a result of COVID, so that cuts both ways. Did you get a one-time boost in revenue because of COVID? Well, we're going to have to adjust for that. But if your downturn was COVID related, I think the buyers are having to kind of accept EBITDA, if you will, EBITDA before COVID, and they're having to pay up. And lenders have enough visibility now that they're making a fair adjustment in their expectations. So I think that problem is largely solved. As for the supply chain, depends on the industry. Yeah, I think it has been solved to an extent, but there's still tremendous problems. The easy example is look at the chips in the auto manufacturers. If I asked you 2 years ago, Mike, what could really shut down domestic auto manufacturing, I don't think you would have said a shortage of chips, but it still exists. There's many companies, cabinet manufacturers, furniture manufacturers can't get the lumber they need or the price is so high. So that one's partially fixed, but it's got a way to go, I guess would be the answer.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you mentioned the lenders for a second there, and that's what I wanted to touch on a little bit right now. And that was, how the lenders responded during this period of time. There's obviously been defaults. What was their reaction like during this time?
They kind of haven't reacted, right? They've been incredibly patient with forbearance. Regulators have given lenders guidance to not push borrowers. I think, I've talked to many lenders who say nothing is a TDR, total debt restructuring. Everything is a quote deferment. And so if you don't have to pay your landlord and you don't have to pay your secured creditor, it's kind of hard not to be performing, right? And so, you combine that with PPP money, boost to the balance sheet, the fact that you really couldn't foreclose as a lender. The state courts were closed. Bankruptcy courts were operating via Zoom, but they were closed for a short period of time. So lenders really just didn't do anything. They tried to work out pretty much every distressed deal, right? They would change amortization, stretch it out over a longer period of time, do whatever they could to give, especially if it was a COVID-related problem, they did everything they possibly could to give that borrower a chance to survive and right the ship. And they continue to do that. I think, they've taken a harder look lately at the quality of management's ability to cut costs, to manage the business going forward. I think they're taking a hard look at liquidity now. How much more runway does a company have? But assuming sound management that they trust and some runway, they're going to continue to be generous with their patients. And I think if the problem was COVID caused, that makes good business sense. It's the right thing to do. On the other hand, if it was a pre-COVID problem, I think lenders are going to probably be taking a harder look now. Is this management team the right team? And do they have enough liquidity to survive? I was participating in a distressed investing conference a few months ago, Mike, and someone asked a workout lender a similar question. Why aren't you being more aggressive? Cruise lines are dead. Why not be more aggressive? And the answer is obvious, but I don't think people had thought about it. Like, do you really want to foreclose on cruise ships right now? So those industries that are most damaged are also the ones where the underlying collateral is most damaged. So a lender doesn't have a great option of, let's shut this down and liquidate. That's probably not going to work out well. I don't think you want to sell a bunch of restaurant equipment right now, for example.
Yeah, good point. The underlying collateral, and the fact is, what good does it do to you to basically collect on that collateral? What are you going to do with it as a lender? Now, you mentioned the buyer side, which for a second there, a few minutes ago, and I was curious about that as well. Now, how have the potential buyers responded or adapted when pursuing acquisitions in the distressed space to what's been happening?
It is amazing. I mean, right as the shutdown happened, we were getting emails and calls almost on a daily basis from distressed buyers, private equity and otherwise, saying, hey, we're open for business. We want to look at opportunities. We see this as a temporary thing. I think there was a very brief window where there was a bit of paralysis, just not enough visibility. I mean, on a very short period, maybe March, maybe a little bit into April. But there are ready buyers, have been the whole time. In our transactions, there have almost always been multiple qualified bids competing. And I think it just comes from, the general marketplace. When you have very low interest rates, you combine that with a hyper competitive market in the healthy space, really high multiples. You have lenders still willing to lend, 3 and 4 times EBITDA. Buyers looked into the distress market and said, maybe this is my opportunity. And sure, they came to the party thinking that they were going to steal something. But by and large, I think they have been fair about taking a realistic approach. Again, I speak of COVID-related challenges here, to be quite fair and say, hey, we've got to consider what this business is likely to be again. What was it pre-COVID? That said, some terms in deals that had gone out of fashion that were non-existent in a frothy market, like earnouts, for example, found their way back into term sheets. And so buyers looked for ways to mitigate risk, whether in healthy and distressed deals. In healthy deals, it was big equity rollovers for key people. In healthy and distressed deals, there were earnout components and things like that. And those earnouts were, stretched out a bit. They were either tied to a COVID-related benchmark, or they were stretched out to make sure that they were defending against what if this goes on for 2 years? But there have been plenty of buyers. The problem is there haven't been a lot of sellers.
It's an interesting problem to have in today's market. Summary of what typically happens in a strong economy will typically slow the level of distressed M&A activity. Do you believe that the anticipated bounce back, we're all hearing about this incredible bounce back that's happening in the economy. Do you think the anticipated bounce back of the economy in 2021 is going to reduce the level of distressed M&A activity?
That's a great question, and it would seem obvious that the answer is yes. But it also would have seemed obvious a year ago that distressed M&A was about to have its boom time, right? You know, we joined SC&H in January of 2020. I moved my whole shop into SC&H. COVID hits in March, and they're like, wow, we're geniuses. We brought on the distressed guys at the perfect time. They're going to be on fire, right? It didn't happen. Almost every workout lender I know, workout banker will say, we geared up. March, April, we added 5, 6 people. 3 or 4 months later, we were moving them to other areas in the bank, right? So I hate to use the overused phrase, but the new normal isn't the old normal. So I think what will actually happen as the market improves and we see this bounce back is the pre-COVID problem children will be dealt with now. They haven't been dealt with for a year. And so maybe it's wishful thinking, Mike, as a distressed M&A guy, but I see an uptick coming as the economy improves, and as we get clear of COVID and shutdowns. Now, for sure, a booming economy is going to float some boats that probably are going to benefit from a strong economy and pent-up demand for a while, and they'll avoid bankruptcy and distressed M&A through 2021, maybe 2022. And then, you know, when's the next recession? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but I would guess 2023. And that's when I would say you'll really see an explosion in distressed M&A, is my guess. But I think it will pick up from where it is today to a steady, moderately busy pace.
That's an interesting perspective on what might be coming down the road. Well, that wraps up my questions, Ken, but if I left anything out, was there anything else you wanted to mention to our viewers today?
No, I would only say, you know, things are changing on a daily basis. Keep reading things like ABL Advisor and the other publications, know who's lending money at what kind of terms, see what the buying market is doing, check in with professionals, you know, and just ask them what's going on, because it's really unclear. It's changing on a daily basis.